bedfellows or former bedfellows are the principal parts of this problem. I mean, they're the gods and goddesses on this landscape. I'm thinking of someone like Candace Owens, who's quite literally trafficking in blood libels now on her incredibly popular podcast. I mean, she's just gone berserk as far as the consequences of my argument is that it's possible to be wrong. It's possible to actually have false beliefs about what is in fact better or worse. You can be confused.
Well, I also think you're
insufficient.
You're insufficiently pessimistic. Twitter is that it operates by game rules that not only don't apply in the real world, but that when exported to the real world, pathologize it. Well, Mr. Harris, it looks like it's time for our approximately annual conversation.
Yeah, nice. You're the clock that ticks once a year.
Yeah, well, I suspect that's more than enough. So tell me what you're thinking about lately, Sam, on the intellectual side and what you're doing.
Well, it is actually relevant to the chaos in our politics at the moment. I'm increasingly worried that we have effectively rendered ourselves ungovernable based on the way we have shattered the information landscape. And I think independent media of the sort that we're indulging now is part of that problem. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but I've been fairly vociferous in criticizing some of our mutual friends, and in my case, some may be former friends, but fellow podcasters and people in independent media, and I just think they've been part of this shattering, and it's been fairly obvious, and the cases are different, but many people have been quite irresponsible in the way that they have platformed people uncritically and let them spread truly divisive and dangerous misinformation. I mean, I'm thinking especially of in the aftermath of October 7th and the global explosion of anti-Semitism. We've had some very big podcasts like Tucker's and Joe's platform Holocaust deniers and revisionists. And it's been quite insane out there. And it's just, I mean, that's just one piece of it. I mean, you can talk about COVID or Trump or Ukraine or, I mean, pick your ugly object out there. There's just a radical divergence of opinion into these echo chambers we built for ourselves. And it seems to be very difficult to cross political lines. I mean, it's somehow deeper than politics, actually. So anyway, I'm just increasingly worried about that, and I'm trying to hold up my side of the conversation in ways so as to cross those lines. But I'm just noticing that it's in many cases it's proving impossible.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I am aware of that. It's actually part of the reason I thought it would be useful for us to talk today. So I want to think about how to respond to that to begin with. Well, I think the first thing that we should probably note is that this is a consequence of hyperconnectivity and stunning ease of communication, right? So, I mean, it's obviously the case that the landscapes of communication that once held us together, for better or worse, are now so multiplicitous that they're numberless. And so what does that mean? I think what it means in part, and this is where I think our conversation might get particularly interesting, is that we don't have a shared story anymore. And I think a culture is literally a shared story. And a story is a structure. This is, been part of our ongoing discussion for a very long period of time, right? The relationship between the perceptual framing that is constituted by a story and, let's say, the domain of objective facts, right? This is a very thorny problem. But it seems to me that you have a culture when people share the same story or the same stories. They have the same shared reference points. And with an infinite landscape of communication, that fragments indefinitely. And then no one, see, Sam, let me tell you, I might as well, just to annoy you, just to get just to get the ball rolling, I spent a lot of time thinking about the story of the Tower of Babel. And there's two stories in Genesis that describe how things go wrong. And one story is the flood, and that's the consequence of absolute chaos bursting forth, essentially. But the Tower of Babel is a story about both totalitarianism and fragmentation. So what happens is the engineers get together, because that's who it is. It's the city builders, the tool makers, those who create weapons of war, the city builders, the engineers. They get together and they build these towers for the aggrandizement of the local potentates. So there was competition in the Middle East of that time to build the highest tower for the glory of the local ruler. And that presumption, so you can think about that as misaligned aim on the sociological front. The consequence of this misaligned aim is a kind of, because the aim of the culture is wrong. Words themselves lose their meaning. That's what happens in the story, right? Everybody ends up speaking a different language, and then the towers fall apart. So it's because the story that's being told is one of human self-aggrandizement. That's part of it. And the culture pathologizes and then disintegrates. And so I see that happening in our culture. There's a technological element of it, obviously, that technological utopians are driving this. The transhumanists are driving this. And we're aiming at the wrong goal. And the consequence of that is that our language is falling apart and we don't share the same reference points. That's part of what's happening. So I'm curious about what you think about that, how that fits in with your concern, your emergent concern. Like, when you say fragmentation, Sam, what is it that you think is fragmenting? Because it's not the objective view of the world precisely, although the scientific enterprise even seems to be shaky and corrupt and falling apart in many ways.
Sam Harris is right. We're living through an epistemic collapse. What used to unify people, shared language, basic facts, reliable institutions, is breaking down. And no, religion isn't the answer. In fact, religion was the original disinformation system. It thrived on dogma, silenced dissent, and punished anyone who questioned the narrative. Christianity, for example, burned scientists alive for challenging biblical cosmology, like Giordano Bruno, and banned books that contradicted scripture. Fast forward to today. Digital media has inherited that same structure, but without even pretending to aim for truth. Algorithms on platforms like X and TikTok amplify lies faster than facts. A 2018 MIT study found that falsehoods on Twitter spread 6 times faster than the truth and reach far more people. So when Peterson talks about a loss of shared stories, he's not wrong that something's breaking. But the answer isn't to go back to religious myth. Religious stories might have unified people, but they did it by force, not reason. What we need now isn't myth. It's a commitment to verifiable evidence, transparency, and a culture that values truth over comfort. Religious certainty helped build the tower. Social media lit the match. And reason is the only thing that can stop the collapse.
Well, so I agree with that. I think the analogy to Babel is quite apt. And I don't think bringing Doge into Babel would have helped much. I think it is technological. Yes, I mean, there's just the fact that there's, because of I think largely this is a story of social media, but it's really the internet generally, because of the information technology we have built, people can find endless confirmation of whatever their cherished opinion is, and it's no longer there's some cultural immune system that has been lost, right? If you had to go to the physical conference out in the real world to meet the other people who were sure they've been abducted by UFOs. Well, then you'd be meeting these people. You would see the obvious signs of dysfunction in their lives, and there'd be more friction to the maintenance of this new conviction, just based on the collision with other ancillary facts that have social relevance to you. But online, I mean, again, this even precedes social media. This is true of the internet back in the late 90s. You can just go down a rabbit hole and find endless confirmation that's fairly anonymized, right? The 20-minute documentary that blew your mind and convinced you that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by the Bush administration. You didn't know that it was made by some 18-year-old in his mother's basement, and you didn't have to know that. You were just looking at the product online. But if you had to meet this person, all of a sudden you'd realize that this is the maintenance of this fiction becomes quite a bit harder. So we're living now, I think, in the second generation of that moment where it really is bottomless. I mean, the ocean of misinformation and half-truth and misunderstanding is bottomless. And the tools we have built to rectify misunderstandings and to spot lies and to be better truth seekers are there, but they have been, in some sense, this is asymmetric warfare. They're no match for the information waste product that can be produced more quickly, right? I mean, this is just the old
Well, it's
problem.
easier to produce noise than signal, obviously.
Yeah, right. Or pseudo signal. Yeah, I mean, there's so much that purports to be signal, right? I mean, again, this is probably socially more inconvenient for you than it is for me. But I mean, many of your bedfellows or former bedfellows are the principal parts of this problem. I mean, they're the gods and goddesses on this landscape. I'm thinking of someone like Candace Owens, who's quite literally trafficking in blood libels now on her incredibly popular podcast. I mean, she's just gone berserk as far as I can tell. And yet, what is the style of conversation that would disconfirm all of that for her audience? At this point, I don't know, because I think what's happened is we've trained up a culture of people or cultures of people that simply don't care about facts. Really, they want a story that aligns with their, in some sense, their confirmation bias. I mean, they have certain things they want to believe. There's certain ideas they like the taste of, and then they just want people catering to that appetite, and there's a good business in that.
Sam Harris is right. The collapse of shared truth isn't a spiritual crisis, it's an information crisis. Social media didn't just fragment our attention, it rewired how people form beliefs. A 2020 RAND study showed that exposure to false information online actually reduces people's ability to discern fact from fiction, even when they know better. Peterson points to the Tower of Babel myth as if shared belief systems once protected us. But Christianity did the opposite. It punished critical thinking, banned books, and burned people alive for questioning authority. That wasn't unity, it was control through fear. What we're seeing today isn't the failure of secularism. It's what happens when we let emotion and ideology replace critical thinking again, just like religion always did. People follow influencers the way they once followed priests. Not because what they say is true, but because it feels good to believe it.
There's a couple of things I'd like to investigate here first. The first is I'd like to return to something that you and I talked about that we wandered around a fair bit in our previous conversations. You had, partly because you were concerned about the distinction between good and evil, and don't let me put words into your mouth, you were hoping to find a objective basis for morality, a way of grounding morality in the objective world. And I have a thought about that that's relevant to our current conversation. So tell me if you accept this proposition. Part of the pathology of Twitter is that it operates by game rules that not only don't apply in the real world, but that when exported to the real world, pathologize it. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
I like that a lot.
Okay. Right. Okay. So here's a way of I think bridging a gap between the way you've been thinking about the world from the moral perspective and the way I've been thinking about it. So, I've always been, I've understood that you had a very deep concern about moral judgment, and that your attempt to provide a scaffolding of objectivity for morality was grounded in that even deeper concern. And I thought that I could understand why you did that. And I didn't agree with the conclusions that you'd drawn, but I agreed with the overall enterprise. And it struck me recently, and I think we've already obliquely made reference to it in our conversation, that there's another way of conceptualizing this relationship between morality and objective fact, and that might be more fruitful to look into the realm of something like, well, it's like theory of iterability, and generalizability. It's maybe a variant of something like game theory. Like, imagine that. So let me give you an example, Sam, and it's a pretty famous example. You know those trading games where behavioral economists sit people down and say, two people, they say, I'll give you $100, you have to make an offer to the, okay.
Yeah.
So the finding across culturally is that people generally approximate a 50% split, right?
Yeah. And they're
give you
highly,
100.
they're not game theoretic with respect to unfair trades. Like they don't want to accept unfair trades even when it would just narrowly be to their advantage to accept them.
Exactly. Okay. And that's true even if they're poor. So if you put a poor person in a situation where they have to accept an unfair trade that would be to their immediate economic benefit, they seem even less likely to accept it. Now, I think the right way to construe that is that if you and I engage in an economic trade, we're doing two things at the same time. The first is what the classical economists would say is we're trying to maximize our gain, let's say. But the problem with that notion is that we aren't playing one game. Or while we're playing one game, we're also setting ourselves up to play a very large and unpredictable sequence of games. Those are happening at the same time. And so we don't want to just optimize for gain in the single game. We want to optimize our status as players in a large series of unpredictable games. And so we want to put ourselves forward as fair players so that people line up to play other games with us. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then imagine that the hallmark of morality is something like generalizable iterability across contexts, right? Because this would allow for, and so you could think about a truly moral system is the most playable game, and an immoral system augurs in. And when we've seen, we're talking about this to some degree with regard to X, because our proposition is that fundamentally, because it's optimizing for short-term attention grip, and it benefits the psychopaths and the short-term gain accruers, the parasites, and perhaps the predators, that it's fundamentally a non-playable game, and that if its consequences generalize outside the world of X, that it pathologizes the environment. And the reason for that is it's not optimally iterable. And so the pattern of morality that would be grounded in the objective world isn't in the world of objective fact. It's in the world of optimized iterability across people and contexts.
Well, I would just say that there's some set of objective facts that subsumes that picture, right? I mean, the world is the way it is. The social world of social primates such as ourselves is the way it is. It admits of certain possibilities, and certain other things are impossible given the kinds of minds we have. Our minds could change in all kinds of ways. They could change by being integrated with technology. They could change by, genetically being manipulated at some point in the future. There's this landscape of possible experience that the right sort of minds could navigate. And we're someplace on that landscape, and we're trying to find our way. And so I view morality as at bottom, a navigation problem, right? And it's got this iterative quality that you describe. The question is, it's always, where can we go from here? Where should we go from here? Where should we go from here, given all the possible places we might go from here, both individually and collectively?
Okay, well, the reason that I got obsessed with stories to begin with, Sam, was because I realized 30 years ago that a story was a description of a navigation strategy. That's what a story is. And so then the question is, okay, let's see if we can formalize this a bit more. The story has to, let's say an optimized story has to iterate and improve. So for example, if you construe your marriage properly, it exists stably, but that's not as good as it could get. It could exist stably and improve as it iterates. And then you can imagine that there's a small world of games that are playable in the actual natural and social world that improve as they iterate. And those games, pointers to that game, those games are moral pointers. And I think that that's what the core of the religious enterprise dives into and elaborates upon. I think that's what makes it the religious enterprise, is that it deeply assesses. So, if imagine this, imagine that your proposition, the proposition you laid out is accurate, is that the fundamental concern is navigation. How do we get from point A to point B? Well, a story, you can think about this and tell me what you think, but I believe that a story is a description of a navigation strategy. If you go see a movie, you infer the aim of the protagonist and you adopt his perceptual frame and his emotional perspective. That's how perception works. And then you can imagine that there are depths of games. Some are shallow, and short-term games that maximize for short-term gain and to hell with everything else are shallow. And games that are sophisticated can be played in many situations with many players. They take the future into account and they improve as you play them. And there's a hierarchy of value in consequence of that is obliquely associated with the world of fact, because it has to operate in the world of fact, but that isn't fundamentally derived from data that's directly associated with the facts.
Well, not operationally, but potentially so. Just not in fact. That's just not. I'm never claiming when I say that there are objective truths to all of these questions, that those objective truths will be delivered by some guy holding a clipboard wearing a white lab coat. But there are things we just know to be true, and it would take a lot of explaining to get to the bottom of how we know them to be true. But I mean, they're very simple claims. We know that life in the best and most refined and most ethically positive sum developed world context, right? You and me and our most conscientious friends at the nicest resort after having done a great day's work, we're enjoying a great meal and talking and creatively and positively about how to improve the world. We know that's a better game than trying to find some child soldiers to torture the neighbors in some malarial hellhole sub-Saharan Africa, and so that we can extract, some heavy metals, the extraction of which is polluting the environment and causing the life expectation to be 30 years lower than it is in where we live, right? I mean, so like they're fundamentally discordant human projects that are available to some very lucky people and unavailable to others, and luck is by no means evenly distributed in this world. So there are better and worse games, right? By any measure of better, you want to, ethically better, or artistically better, entrepreneurially better, economically better. It's just better with respect to the health outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So we're all trying to play the best game we can be a part of. We're all trying. I mean, some people. I take that back. Many of us are. We're all trying to play the best game we can think of as best, but one of the consequences of my argument is that it's possible to be wrong. It's possible to actually have false beliefs about what is in fact better or worse. Like you can be confused.
I also think you're insufficient. You're insufficiently pessimistic too, Sam. I think because I don't think everyone is trying to play the best possible game. I think that there are truly negative games.
Sam Harris is right. Morality doesn't come from ancient religious texts. It comes from real-world consequences, and we can observe and measure it. In fact, when you compare secular societies to religious ones, the data is clear. According to the 2021 World Happiness Report, the top 10 happiest countries, Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, Iceland, are also among the least religious. They're not using the Bible to navigate morality. They're using evidence-based policy, strong education, healthcare, and trust. Meanwhile, highly religious countries like Nigeria, Pakistan, or Venezuela often rank lower in human rights, gender equality, and democratic stability. That's not moral progress. That's what happens when religion dominates law instead of reason. And when Peterson calls religious stories deep moral pointers, we should ask, to what? The Bible is filled with genocide, slavery, misogyny. Leviticus demands death for adultery. Deuteronomy promotes ethnic cleansing. These aren't moral blueprints. They're Iron Age laws from tribal societies. What really works? Iterability, as Harris said. The ability to test a decision across different contexts. If a principle works across time, cultures, and outcomes, it's moral. That's what Harris calls the landscape of well-being. And it's not a theory. It's supported by moral psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral economics. For example, Paul Bloom's research at Yale shows infants have innate moral instincts, a preference for fairness and kindness, long before they're taught religion. Harvard's Joshua Green uses fMRI studies to show that moral decisions light up brain regions linked to empathy and prediction, not revelation. Steven Pinker showed in The Better Angels of Our Nature that as societies became more secular, violence dropped and human rights expanded. So no, morality isn't a religious story. It's a scientific, social, and evolutionary process. Religion didn't invent it. It just tried to control it. Your move. If we can use reason, data, and empathy to build a better world, do we really need a book that says women should stay silent and slaves should obey?
Suppose that Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the Sun from eternity past, now which will have completed the most number of orbits. The correct mathematical answer is that the number of their orbits is identical. But that seems absurd. For the longer they orbit, the further the disparity between them grows. So how does the number of their orbits magically become identical just by making them orbit from eternity past? These and many other examples suggest that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. But That entails that since past events are not just ideas in your mind, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. Man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Now, Dr. Atkins is a reasonable man, and therefore he should be convinced by the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and face this problem of a cosmic beginning. And in fact, as I say in his book, he does so. He argues that the way you get around the problem is by saying that nothing exists, that there was nothing then and there is nothing now, but I didn't hear a response to my refutation of that the argument for that based on positive and negative energy is misguided, and secondly, that the conclusion is absurd because it's self-contradictory and all.
As to morality, one is led by religion into dreadful corners of the world. Let me remind you of an article that appeared in The Independent last week. It touches upon Manchester. Worshippers in Manchester, perhaps you were among them, although what I'm about to say suggests that you were not. Worshippers in Manchester have stopped taking life-saving drugs after being persuaded about the healing power of God. And a BBC London investigation yesterday revealed that
my doctoral studies at the University of Birmingham, we came to have a warm affection for this country and her people, and I consider it a real joy and a delight to be here with you tonight. Thank you very much for coming. Now, in tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, there are good reasons to think that theism is true, and secondly, there are not comparably good reasons to think that atheism is true. Now, I'll leave it up to Dr. Atkins to present his arguments for atheism before I respond to them. In this opening speech, I want to sketch briefly 3 lines of evidence that weigh in favor of God's existence. As a professional philosopher, I think that God makes sense of a wide range of the data of human experience, including philosophical, scientific, moral, and historical considerations. Number 1, then, the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Why anything at all exists rather than nothing? Did the universe have a beginning? Or does it just go back and back forever? Typically, atheists have said that the universe is just eternal and uncaused. But there are good reasons, both philosophical and scientific, to call into question that assumption. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past is very problematic. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the real existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. To give just one example, suppose you had an actually infinite number of coins numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity. And suppose I took away all the odd-numbered coins. How many coins would you have left? Well, you'd still have all the even-numbered coins, or an infinity of coins. So, infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead that I took away all the coins numbered greater than 3. Now how many coins would you have left? 3. So, infinity minus infinity is 3. In each case, I took away an identical number of coins from an identical number of coins and came up with contradictory results. In fact, you can subtract infinity from infinity and get any result from 0 to infinity. For this reason, inverse operations like subtraction and division are simply prohibited in transfinite arithmetic. But in the real world in which we live, such a convention has no sway. Obviously, you can give away any coins that you want. Here's another example of the absurdity of an infinite past. Take the planets Jupiter and Saturn. Suppose that for every orbit that Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. If Saturn has completed 10 orbits, Jupiter has completed 20. If Saturn has completed 1 trillion, Jupiter has completed 2 trillion. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. If they continue to orbit forever, then they will approach a limit at which Saturn will be infinitely far behind Jupiter. But now turn the story around. Suppose that Jupiter and Saturn have been orbiting the Sun from eternity past, now which will have completed the most number of orbits. The correct mathematical answer is that the number of their orbits is identical. But that seems absurd. For the longer they orbit, the further the disparity between them grows. So how does the number of their orbits magically become identical just by making them orbit from eternity past? These and many other examples suggest that infinity is just an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. But that entails that since past events are not just ideas in your mind, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This purely philosophical conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. We now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. In 2003, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. What makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the early universe. Because we don't yet have a quantum theory of gravity, we can't yet provide a physical description of the first split second of the universe. But
William Lane Craig opens by asking a question few want to touch. Why is there something rather than nothing? For him, both logic and science point to one answer. The universe had a beginning, and things that begin don't just pop into existence uncaused. He points to the Bord-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which makes it clear, even if there are multiple universes, all signs still point to a starting line. No eternal past, no infinite timeline, just a beginning that demands an explanation. Peter Atkins, representing the atheist view, leans hard on science, suggesting that the universe could arise from nothing. But that nothing isn't really nothing. It's a quantum vacuum governed by laws, math, and energy. That's something hiding behind a label. Of course, Craig doesn't let it slide. If the universe began, and that vacuum isn't truly nothing, then what triggered existence itself? You can sidestep the question. You can rename the problem. But at some point, you have to face it. Either everything came from absolutely nothing, or something beyond the universe started it all. Let's see where Atkins takes it from here.
I think we should agree that theism is the more plausible worldview.
Thank you, Professor Craig. Can I ask Professor Atkins now to give his opening presentation?
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. My immediate task, of course, is to set up my stall, not to respond to Dr. Craig's arguments at this stage. That will come later, although, as you will see, some of my remarks now will in fact touch upon what he has just raised. In fact, my task is to bring you forward from the 11th century, where you've been immersed with considerable erudition for the past 20 minutes, and bring you into the 21st century, and to present arguments based on 1,000 years of increasing knowledge about the world. Dr. Craig would have been a wonderful medieval apologist, and it's a pleasure to hear his erudite reprise, with a few elaborations, of course, of what could have been said 1,000 years ago. I do not say that scornfully. Dr. Craig has touched on arguments that have long troubled thinkers, believers, and disbelievers alike, and their longevity underlines their importance to mankind. But first, an admission. I cannot prove that God does not exist. Everything there is could be the creation of an extraordinary entity that surpasses our understanding. It could be that the universe was created only a millisecond ago, with all our memories suddenly but falsely in place. It could be, as God is outside time, whatever that meaningless phrase means, that he hasn't decided even to make us yet. It's just conceivable that God did indeed create the universe 13.7 billion years ago. I cannot prove that he did not. All I can do is to assemble evidence that leads to the conclusion that God is not necessary for any aspect of the current world, and that there is a far simpler explanation for everything than the assertion of the existence of an omnipotent God. I have to say, of course, that many hold that the assertion that God made it is far, far simpler as an explanation of everything than a more pedestrian account in terms of physical laws. God, they say, is surely a simpler explanation than complex mechanism. Don't be seduced. The assertion that God did anything is simplistic rather than simple, and it is lazy. It is simplistic because an entity as functionally unbounded as a God must be of extraordinary complexity. It is lazy because it avoids becoming involved in untangling the web of events that have led to us. Any argument that simply asserts that God did it is a sign of a lazy mind, a mind that is content to wallow in assertion rather than embark upon climbing the intellectual Everest of comprehension. My argument against God is that there is nothing in the universe that cannot be explained, in prospect at least, without invoking that complex hypothesis. In other words, there are simpler explanations, or at least the prospect of simpler explanations, for absolutely everything. Because there are simpler explanations, or the prospect of them, there is no need to burden our understanding with the assertion that there is something more, namely an incomprehensible God. That billions of people believe to the contrary is of no consequence. Truth is not arrived at by majority vote. There are clearly huge psychological and cultural pressures imposed on people from an early age, and belief has been honed by the powerful into a potent weapon of crowd control. In the nasty, brutish brevity of an impoverished life, great comfort comes from the belief that there is better to come. There is also satisfaction that wrongdoers, wealthy perhaps on earth, will get their comeuppance in the afterlife. Even the meek are in with a chance. Angst and hope, angst at the prospect of one's own annihilation, and hope for unbounded ecstasy to come are potent drivers into the jaws of belief. But the potency of the drivers and the huge majority of the hopers does not mean that the belief is correct. I've made a strong but carefully worded claim. that there is nothing in the universe that cannot be explained or has the prospect of being explained without invoking a God. I need to justify that claim. If you accept my argument that a God is unnecessary, then your only recourse, if you insist on believing that there is a God, is to admit that you are driven by your heart rather than your head. But hearts are unreliable organs of knowledge. I shall deal with 6 points: contingency, fitness, purpose, miracles, including resurrections, theodicy, and morality. Obviously, and perhaps mercifully, I don't have time to be thorough on any of these topics, but perhaps by setting out the ground we can turn to finer arguments later. In each case, I shall argue that modern science, the agent of the new Enlightenment, promises, I can offer no more than that, to elucidate what theology has long obscured. First, contingency. Science currently doesn't have the slightest clue about how a universe can come into existence out of absolutely nothing without intervention. I will leave aside whether the universal is eternal in some sense and without a beginning. That's something to be determined by observation, not by the ruminations of philosophy. We simply don't know. To make it harder for myself, I shall suppose for the sake of argument that there was a beginning. But there are 2 kinds of beginning, and it's important to distinguish them. One type of beginning is when an already existing universe gives rise to a daughter universe. Another type of a beginning is when absolutely nothing turns into a universe. I shall call that latter universe an original universe. Now, as you've just heard, some assert that a universe can spring from a quantum fluctuation. That may be true of a daughter universe, for an already existing mother universe has physical laws and a richly propertied vacuum. But when there is absolutely nothing, there are no physical laws, no quantum fluctuation. It's an empty term for the emergence of an original universe. And to make things harder for myself, but with an eye on trying to answer and not evade a deeply important question, I shall set aside the simpler problem of a daughter universe and consider the formation of an original universe. Did that original universe, although perhaps contingent, have to be caused? You have to realize that physical laws, which are summaries of observed behavior, come into existence as a universe comes into existence. That includes issues of causality. It is naive in the extreme to extrapolate our own experience of causality, which is essentially the working out of the consequences of physical laws, to an era before those laws existed. It is entirely possible that the unique event that marked the inception of the physical laws was itself an uncaused event. And what science has to do, in due course, is to discover how absolutely nothing can tumble into being and become apparently something. Is there any reason to believe that it might succeed? There's no doubt that it's actually edging towards that goal by burrowing back in time to discover that there was what there was immediately after the creation event. Look how far it has come in the past 100 years. We are starting to be confident about what first appeared.
Peter Atkins begins with a clear position. The existence of God cannot be disproven, but the concept is not required to explain the universe. His argument rests on the view that every observable phenomenon can, in principle, be understood through natural processes. There is no need to introduce a supernatural cause when the available tools of science already address the questions once reserved for theology. In physics, The origin of the universe is explored through models based on quantum field theory and general relativity. Physicists such as Edward Tryon, Alexander Vilenkin, and Alan Guth have developed frameworks in which a universe can emerge from a quantum vacuum. These models are grounded in established physical principles and published in peer-reviewed contexts. They examine conditions where space, time, matter, and energy do not yet exist in classical forms. The quantum vacuum in these models is not empty space, but a pre-geometric state governed by probabilistic fluctuations. It has no particles or fields in the classical sense, but it permits spontaneous events due to its underlying structure. This is not a speculative leap. It is derived from the mathematics used to describe quantum systems and is consistent with the theoretical foundations of modern cosmology. Experimental advancements continue to inform these models, including those from particle accelerators, satellite measurements of the cosmic microwave background, and high-precision gravitational data. Physical laws, in this view, are not prescriptive forces imposed from outside. They describe regularities that emerge as physical systems develop. The law-like behavior observed in nature reflects consistent patterns rather than imposed order. Causality, time, and space are not treated as eternal categories but as emergent properties tied to the structure of the system. Atkins also addresses ethics and human behavior. Moral norms, cooperation, and legal structures are developed through social interaction, negotiation, and institutional memory. These systems function through accountability, shared understanding, and revision, not through appeals to divine authority. Global studies show that societies without strong religious frameworks continue to build systems that address justice, welfare, and civil order through public mechanisms. Historically, many institutions that shape human rights, medicine, and law have emerged through empirical inquiry and political struggle, rather than from sacred texts. Legislative assemblies, universities, courts, and scientific academies operate through transparent procedures and ongoing correction. Changes in legal rights, bodily autonomy, and freedom of expression were often developed through public debate, not religious mandate.
I'd like to perhaps paraphrase a remark by the economist J.K. Galbraith, who said that astrology was invented in order to make economic forecasting look respectable. I'd like to say that theology was invented to make philosophy look respectable. You've heard nothing but obfuscation. Let me remind you, because I have to, my first rebuttal refers to the first 20 minutes of Dr. Craig's presentation, rather than his immediate one. The level of argument that we heard relating to the eternal nature of the universe, it was that planets clearly have not been going round the sun an infinite number of times. I shorten the rather ludicrous argument that we actually heard. No one ever says that. He's raised a straw man. What we're really concerned about is whether the universe itself is infinite. And we can measure the life of the solar system as about 5 billion years. We can measure the life of the universe as 13.7 billion years. We weren't talking about that at all. We were talking about whether the sequence of universes might be infinite and that there was never actually a beginning. You cannot argue against that by philosophy. You cannot argue against that by theology. The only way you can argue about it is by looking at the evidence, and we heard no evidence whatsoever. And arguments about infinity are always extraordinarily doubtful. I mean, Professor Craig said that an infinite number of events has never occurred in the universe. I refer him to Zeno, halving the distance again, never getting anywhere. But clearly, if you've got an infinite number of halving of the distances, you get anywhere you want to. So never listen to an argument about infinity. It's infinitely slippery. The travesty of my remarks about nothing coming from nothing. let me take that as an example. What I wanted to show is that science is circumspect in the way that it approaches the great questions of being. Okay, it looks around, and if you're a naive looker around, a philosopher, a theologian, a gardener, a farmer, you will see a huge amount of energy in the universe, and you will marvel at God's bounty. But then, as a scientist, you think again, and you say, yes, I can measure the amount of energy in the universe. I won't just lie back and think about it. I will measure it, because once I put numbers to ideas, they become testable and verifiable. And to determine the energy of the universe, the first thing I do is to weigh it. So I weigh the mass, I determine the mass of a galaxy, and then I multiply it by the square of the speed of light. And through E equals mc squared, I get the energy that that galaxy represents. I do it for this galaxy, that galaxy, this galaxy, every galaxy in the universe, not just the ones we can see. And I get a colossal value. And I lie back and wonder at God's munificence. And then I say, but I've forgotten something, which is the gravitational attraction between galaxies. And whenever you have two attracting bodies, they lower their energy. And if you take the gravitational attraction of this galaxy with that one, it lowers that first sum we got a little bit. Then this galaxy with that one, this galaxy with that one, this galaxy with that one. And the signs are, and we're not completely certain about this, because we do not jump to conclusions in science. We are circumspect, imaginative, and honest. We find that that gravitational attraction reduces that original huge energy we had to zero. In other words, God's munificence was zero. And you don't need a God if the God isn't going to give you anything. What science does is to simplify the questions that need to be answered. It doesn't say, there was nothing originally, there's nothing now. What it does is to simplify the question that needs to be asked. We're moving cautiously, imaginatively, and reliably to understanding the incipience of the universe by identifying what questions truly have to be answered. There is nothing here, I will concede that, but it's an extremely interesting form of nothing. There was nothing originally, there is nothing here now, but it's through whatever event took place at the inception of the universe, it became an interesting form of nothing, which seems to be something. It may be metaphysical, and it may sound stupid, but what I'm doing is identifying the question that needs to be answered, not just sitting back in awe and saying, look at the universe, fantastic job, it obviously needed someone really rather special to do it. The resurrection, if I can jump forward, I do notice that Professor Craig, although I made 6 points, did not deal with all 6. Perhaps I should deal with all 3 of his. His second, of course, was the objectivity of moral values. To say that you cannot be moral without a God is frankly disgusting. I am moral. I do not believe that I am guided by a God. And I think it casts a slur on atheists everywhere in the world to presume that they are evil because they believe there is no God. Morals, as I asserted in my opening presentation, the emergence of morals should be understood. They should not simply be accepted. You should try to find the roots of moral behavior, hard as it is to trace the emergence of moral thinking as one's own body begins at 1 cell and turns into 1 trillion cells, as Evolution proceeds through billions of years. As people begin to think about the consequences of their actions, that's the way to understand morality, not just to lie back and think that there is an umpire in the sky somewhere. Try to understand. All I'm saying is that it is healthier to understand. If Voltaire said in one of my favorite quotations that people who believe in absurdities commit atrocities. And I think we see that in religious belief, where atrocities are affected in the name of dogma. The resurrection, I must deal with that in miracles. Of course, David Hume got it right when he said that there's always more reason to disbelieve the report than there is to believe what is reported. Look at the Gospels. You can't really believe it. Pretend we were writing about events 60 years ago when there was no actual real record. We wouldn't get it right. We'd make up a lot of it. The Gospels are political propaganda sheets. And it's inevitable and understandable that they were invented to make the point that they were trying to make. Yes, Joshua, if he existed, Jesus, I suppose you might call him, and I can well believe that in the Palestine of 2,000 years ago, there were lots of Joshuas around, that was probably a very nice man, and was certainly written up to be a very nice man by the people compiling the Gospels to establish the creed that they wanted to. But the actual evidence is extremely slender. The evidence in favor of an actual resurrection is compiled by those who start from a prejudicial point of view that it did occur and then seek to justify it. Others, those who deny the resurrection, say, this is such an extraordinary event, we need real extraordinary evidence to support it. And there is no real extraordinary evidence to support it. So why should you believe it? Because you can see that it was invented as a political manifesto? No, you cannot possibly believe it. And all this gibberish about having to justify atheism, I mean, that's another example of false premise. If I come into a room and say, I don't understand anything, I will start from the simplest explanation, and I will let you convince me.
Peter Atkins lays out two key points, both grounded in what science and history actually show. First, the claim that the universe requires a divine beginning doesn't match how cosmology works. Physicists like Edward Tryon and Alexander Vilenkin have developed models showing that a universe can emerge from a quantum vacuum, a state with no classical matter, space, or time. This isn't a loophole. It's a real possibility supported by quantum field theory, the same framework that underpins much of modern physics. In this framework, the total energy of the universe, once gravitational effects are included, may balance to zero. If that's the case, then the question of where the energy came from doesn't even need to be asked. There's no debt, no transaction, just a starting point that unfolds through known physical principles. Second, morality doesn't require belief in a deity to exist or to function. Human behavior, cooperation, and ethical reasoning can be traced through evolution, social dynamics, and shared experience. Data from Pew and Gallup show that people in non-religious societies still support justice, fairness, and care for others. Atkins doesn't reject meaning or mystery. He rejects the idea that those things need to be filled with untestable claims. When it comes to miracles like the resurrection, the same principle applies. Claims that break natural patterns require more than tradition. They need evidence. Where do you stand? Do you think morality depends on religion, or can we shape ethics and compassion without it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this gave you ideas, be sure to like, subscribe, and share to keep the conversation going.